Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. We are talking about Matthew 27. We're near the very, very end of our chapter a day read along, the Gospel of Matthew this Advent 2022, where this is the next to the last chapter. And we are joined today by a fantastic guest, and I will invite her to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm the Reverend Gia Hayes-Martin. I serve as the rector of St. John's in Worthington, Ohio, a suburb of Columbus in the Diocese of Southern Ohio. I am right down the street from Jason. In fact, are we the closest to each other? I think we might be.
It wouldn't surprise me if we are. Yeah, in Central Ohio for sure.
Yeah. So. All right. So we're neighbors.
Yes. Excellent. All right. So what did you read in chapter 27?
We're starting off with the morning of Good Friday, where the chief priests and the elders are conferring about Jesus, conspiring against him, and deciding finally to put him to death. They hand him over to Pilate. Judas sees what's going on, has some regrets. He's been paid 30 pieces of silver. He brings them back to the chief priests and elders and says, I've sinned. And he throws down the pieces of silver in the temple, goes off and hangs himself. The chief priests are saying, what do we do with this money? It's tainted by blood. We can't use it. So they buy a field to be used for a place to bury foreigners. And Matthew says this is in fulfillment of a prophecy of Jeremiah. And the scene shifts to Jesus standing before Pilate. Pilate's interrogating him. Are you the king of the Jews? Jesus says, you say so. But when the chief priests and elders and Pilate attempt to follow up with him, Jesus remains silent. Matthew says there's a custom that at the festival, I think he means Passover. He must mean Passover if we're on Good Friday, right? There's this alleged the Passover custom that the governor would release a prisoner for the crowd, whoever the crowd wanted. Barabbas is also in prison. Pilate asks the crowd, who do you want me to release for you? The crowd says, Barabbas. Pilate's sitting on the judgment seat, kind of weighing what to do. His wife sends him a message saying, I had a dream about this guy. It's really distressed me. Don't do anything to harm him. Meanwhile, the chief priests and the elders are out working the crowd and persuading them to ask for Barabbas and have Jesus be killed. Pilate asks again, who do you want me to release? The crowd calls for Barabbas. Pilate says, all right, then what do I do with Jesus? And all of them say, let him be crucified. And they shout that again, let him be crucified. Pilate thinks that a riot is about to begin. That freaks him out. So he washes his hands and says, I'm innocent of this man's blood. And the crowd responds, let his blood be on us and on our children. Pilate lets Barabbas go, has Jesus flogged, and hands him over to be crucified. The soldiers bring Jesus into the governor's headquarters. They strip him, put the crown of thorns on him, mock him with the reed in his hand, saying he's king of the Jews. And then they take him out to crucify him. As they're going, they come upon a man called Simon of Cyrene. They make him carry the cross. They get to Golgotha, offer Jesus wine mixed with gall. He wouldn't drink it. Then they crucify Jesus, divide his clothes by casting lots. And the soldiers sit down there and watch. And they put this charge over his head that reads, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. There's two bandits with him, one on his right, one on his left. People are passing by saying, you would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Well, save yourself. If you're God's son, come down from the cross and save yourself. The chief priests and scribes and elders are also mocking him. You saved others. Why can't you save yourself? And the bandits are also taunting him in the same way, these two guys from the cross, going back and forth with each other. From noon on, it gets really dark over the whole land until about 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cries out with a loud voice, the first lines of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? One of the bystanders goes and gets some sour wine, puts it on a sponge and a stick and offers it up to Jesus. Jesus cries out and dies. And at that moment, the temple curtain is torn in two. earthquake, tombs are open, bodies of saints are resurrected. The centurion who's watching all this says, truly, this man was God's son. Matthew notes that women were there. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee are there watching him. When evening comes, Joseph of Arimathea, who was Matthew says, a disciple of Jesus, Joseph goes to Pilate, asks for Jesus' body. Pilate agrees for it to be taken away. So Joseph takes Jesus' body, wraps it in clean linen, and places it in Joseph's own tomb, rolls the stone in front of the tomb opening, and goes away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary are there, continuing to bear watch with Jesus. The next morning, the chief priests and Pharisees go back before Pilate and say, hey, while this guy was still alive, he said, after 3 days, I'll rise again. So you'd better set a guard on the tomb to make sure that he stays dead and stays in there, so that his disciples don't steal him away and claim that he's been raised. So Pilate says, you've got a guard of soldiers, go do what you need to do. And so they set the chief priests and Pharisees, set a guard over the tomb and make it secure by sealing the stone. And that's where we end on what we now remember as Holy Saturday.
So yeah, very uneventful chapter.
Yes, not much happened there.
Not much happened at all. What stood out for you?
A couple things. The first one was Jesus' silence. He's been talking and talking and talking and talking throughout this gospel.
Yeah.
In the Gospel of Matthew, if you go back to the Sermon on the Mount, that's 3 solid chapters of Jesus talking with almost no description of what he's doing or who's there. He says 3 words in verse 11. He says 4 words in verse 46. He cries out in verse 50, and that's the only thing that he says. His true disciples are also pretty well silent. Joseph of Arimathea is the only one who speaks, and he isn't quoted directly. It just says that he goes to Pilate and asks for Jesus' body. The women at the tomb are silent. Simon of Cyrene is silent. It's like there's this hive of activity around all of this, and Jesus and his faithful disciples are this center of stillness and calm in the midst of everything that is happening around them.
Yeah, I've never picked up on that. That's awesome. What do you think that's about?
Ask me this on Good Friday and I'll have a better answer.
I'm taking notes for Good Friday, that's for sure.
Oh, so am I. I think maybe Jesus has hit the point where there's nothing left to say. You know, he has said everything there is to say. He has proclaimed as close as he gets to in Matthew who he is and why he has come. He knows that this has got to happen. Nothing he says now is going to make any difference. The machinery of justice, such as it is going to roll on no matter what he does or says. Right.
Well, as you were talking about the amount of silence, it struck me. I was thinking back. There is a bit of a birth narrative in Matthew, but really not much, and not a lot of people speak in it. You know, relative to like Luke, where everybody bursts into song like it's a Broadway musical. And you know, the sort of at both birth and death, there's profound silence. In the gospel where Jesus speaks more than in any of the other gospels, right? I mean, it's structured, you know, it's 5 discourses, and, you know, kind of patterned after the law of Moses, or the 5 books of Moses. And so, you know, it's really heavy on teaching and parables and sermons, and yet at birth and death, it's in the deed done.
Yeah. Have you ever seen The Gospel According to Matthew, the film from the 60s, directed by Pier Paolo Pasolini?
Yeah, but I think so, because I think they would. No, I've heard of that. I don't think I've seen it. I'm thinking of the one from the 70s or 80s that they used to show on TV. It was Jesus of Nazareth.
Oh yeah, this is not that.
Yeah.
Pasolini cast this with entirely non-professional actors, just local people. And the script is the Gospel of Matthew. The only lines of dialogue are the words that people say in the Gospel. So the entire first chapter where Joseph is finding out about Mary, but they don't actually speak to each other, is all done in this. They're non-professionals and they're trying really hard, but they're trying to convey all of this through gesture and facial expression, and it only sort of works. For the Sermon on the Mount scene, Jesus talking for 3 solid chapters is just, it's a close-up shot of his head and shoulders, and he's talking and talking and talking. And meanwhile, a storm blows in and he's getting drenched and it gets dark, and then dawn comes and he's still talking. He is still talking. And I don't remember the end of this. But as I remember back to the film of that, the contrast between silence and speech is so noticeable in that dramatization of it. I want to say this film is available for free on YouTube. So in your copious spare time,
right,
10 days before Christmas Eve, right, go watch it.
Yeah, that sounds powerful though. I'll have to check that out at some point in time for sure. And I think there's also something this video is going to be airing on the 23rd of December. We're getting ready for our massive celebrations of the incarnation, and to think about the death at the same time as the birth, and know that those two things, without one or the other, the whole thing kind of falls apart, right? Life, death, resurrection, ascension, they're all necessary. I think that
so this church was built as a children's chapel, and so the stained glass windows are featuring children. And there's one right up over the altar that shows Jesus as a child, like preschooler age, 2, 3, something like that. And he's kind of classic white baby Jesus, with the ringlets and the blue eyes and so on. But he's looking down at a passion flower. He's holding a passion flower. And the point is that the crucifixion, his death, is present there at his birth also. Those two things are always intertwined.
Right. And the new birth of resurrection isn't possible without the crucifixion.
Yes.
Right. So
you gotta die to get to resurrection.
Right. So in some ways, the incarnation too, like we can't celebrate the birth of Jesus if there isn't a life and a death and a resurrection as well. Yeah. So good stuff. Good stuff.
The other thing that really struck me about this chapter is how hard Matthew is working to exonerate Pilate. We know historically that only the Roman governor had the authority to impose crucifixion. It was a Roman punishment. Yep. It was not used by, there's no record at all of it ever being used by Jews or other conquered peoples. It's pretty unlikely that the Romans would have allowed a conquered people to carry out justice on their own without reference to the Roman system. And yet over and over, Matthew sets up this crowd scene with this tradition of releasing a prisoner for Jesus. Pilate's wife says, don't do anything to that man. The chief priests are out there whipping up the crowd to demand Jesus' death. Pilate is afraid that a riot is beginning, and so he washes his hands. The thought that Pilate's got the army on his side, the thought that Pilate is afraid of a crowd, I just don't find that plausible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this awful line that the crowd says, that his blood be on us and on our children. It's Matthew is trying to shift the responsibility away from Pilate and onto the Jewish leadership and to the crowds, which would have been overwhelmingly Jewish as well. And I now expect to see this when I'm reading the Passion narratives, and it takes me aback every time still. Just how vehement the insistence that the Pilate had nothing to do with this. This is all the Jews' fault, which we know has had pretty catastrophic consequences for the Jewish people throughout the years.
Mm-hmm. Well, Matthew being written 50 years after, these events occurred, and already we see this is kind of an element of, or evidence of the church. I don't know, courting the empire.
Yeah.
Maybe this is, maybe the church courting the empire to better its standing.
Yeah.
And that has never worked out well for the church.
Yeah, I think maybe at best the church was trying to defend itself from persecution. Say, look, we love the Romans. You don't need to attack us.
Right. And the Jews are no longer a threat because you destroyed the temple. So let's just we'll blame them, and you've already taken care of them. So you don't need to look at us. Don't look at us. Don't throw us in that briar patch.
Can't we all get along?
Yeah. But yeah, even then, way before Constantine, where the church is already courting the empire, and that to catastrophic results.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think much of the challenge that we're grappling with in terms of the decline of church going and Christianity losing its privileged place in the world is that devil's bargain finally coming unraveled.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a Christmassy note to end on.
And yet, who are we as followers of Jesus? Who and what will the church be when it isn't tied to that myth, that untruth that we have tied ourselves to for so long? And what's the new life for us on the other side of that?
Yeah. That's kind of exciting to think about. And I'll pray we are willing to go through the necessary crucifixion to get there.
Yeah.
So listen, thank you so much. It's fitting that the longest chapter in Matthew ends up being our longest video. So, but thank you so much to the Reverend Gia Hayes-Martin for her insights on chapter 27. And y'all keep reading. We got one more chapter to go. Finish up on Christmas Eve tomorrow with chapter 28. We have another special guest for that. And hit that like and subscribe button. Share this to your social media and help support the ministries of St. Patrick's by going to pats-dublin.org/give, making a contribution today. And remember, no matter what, God loves you more than you can possibly imagine.
Amen.